Hey there, viewers. Have you ever accidentally left your camera or mic on and instantly regretted it? Share your most embarrassing moment in the comments. Today's story takes that to a whole new level. Diddy forgot to turn off his camera, and what happened next left everyone stunned. Let's get into it. Chapter 1: The Last Meeting. There's something about silence that makes a place feel unnatural. It's like a house that's too clean, too put together, like someone scrubbed the life out of it. And that's what this penthouse felt like. The walls were lined with expensive art, Basquiat's, Picasso's, pieces that cost more than most people would make in a lifetime. But they didn't feel lived in. It was like they were put there to impress people, not to be enjoyed. Shelves were stocked with bottles of champagne, whiskey, and liquor with labels in languages I couldn't read. The leather couch I was sitting on smelled new, even though I knew it wasn't. I had been in this room before. I had seen deals made, secrets whispered, egos nursed, and power flexed in ways most people wouldn't understand. But I had never sat here alone, at this hour, watching something I wasn't supposed to see. The glow from my laptop screen was the only light in the room. It reflected off the glass table, casting sharp angles along the dark wood floors. I should have turned on a lamp, but I didn't want to. There was something about this moment that felt like it needed darkness. I dragged the cursor across the screen, rewinding the video again. It was a recording from a Zoom meeting held the night before. A standard business call, one of many I had sat in on. The kind where people talked in circles, said a lot but meant nothing, and threw around words like damage control and optics as if they were discussing the weather. I watched Diddy sitting at the head of the virtual table. His face was lit by the soft amber glow of a chandelier, a glass of whiskey in his hand, barely paying attention as his team spoke. His usual arrogance was there, that look of someone who had spent decades being untouchable. He leaned back in his chair, occasionally nodding, muttering a yeah or handle it when necessary. I knew this version of him well, the composed, measured, all-powerful businessman who let his people do the worrying for him. But something changed in the last 5 minutes. The meeting ended. One by one, the little squares disappeared from the screen as executives, lawyers, and PR reps signed off. Diddy muttered a goodbye, set his glass down, and stretched his arms. Then, he assumed the camera was off. But it wasn't. The moment was so small at first that I almost missed it. A shift in his demeanor, a slight tension in his shoulders. He rubbed his hands together, exhaled, then reached for his phone. I could see the glow of the screen reflect in his eyes as he typed something. His jaw clenched. That usual smoothness was gone. Then he spoke. "Yeah, it's done." A pause. His lips pressed together and he swallowed hard. "No, but listen. I need to know if you took care of it." I leaned forward, my stomach twisting. Took care of what? The voice on the other end was muffled, impossible to make out, but Diddy's responses were enough to paint the picture. "I don't care what they said. Did you erase everything?" His fingers tapped against the desk. He nodded slightly as if getting confirmation, but then his expression darkened. His lips parted, but he didn't say anything right away. He just sat there, listening, for too long, as if someone was still speaking to him even after the call ended. A chill crept up my spine. I checked the time on the video. The call had disconnected 30 seconds ago. But Diddy was still responding. Then his eyes moved, not toward his phone, not toward anything visible on screen. He was looking at something off camera. "You're sure?" he said, after a long silence. "Because if this gets out, we're all dead." My heartbeat stuttered. The room around me felt smaller, heavier. I rewound the video, staring at that moment again, at his face, at the way his pupils dilated, his breath slowed. He wasn't just looking at something. He was listening to something. Or someone. I turned the volume up, listened carefully. There was no sound, No second voice, just the soft creak of his chair, the clink of ice in his glass. But the way he was reacting, it was as if he was receiving instructions. I swallowed, my throat dry. I had seen a lot in my time working for Diddy, more than I'd ever admit. The parties, the things people whispered about but never dared to confirm, the stories that floated around the industry like smoke, stories of people disappearing, of tapes that existed but could never be found. This was different. I clicked pause, staring at the frozen frame. Diddy's face caught in that brief second of unease. That wasn't the face of a man in control. That was the face of a man afraid. My fingers hovered over the trackpad. The file sat there, open, waiting for me to make a choice. I should have deleted it. I should have closed the laptop and walked away. But I didn't. I watched it again and again until the feeling in my gut turned into something cold and certain. This wasn't just a mistake. This was something bigger. And I was the only one who knew. Chapter 2. The tape that shouldn't exist. I didn't sleep. Not really. I sat in that penthouse, the glow of my laptop screen burning into my retinas, the city outside humming with life while I remained frozen in place. The recording played on loop, and with every replay, the room felt smaller, darker. The air thickened, the walls seemed closer. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath the couch. Sounds I never paid attention to before became amplified. The weight of what I had in my possession pressed down on me like something tangible, something alive. I watched Diddy's face, frame by frame, looking for something, anything that might explain what I was seeing. He wasn't drunk. His words were too precise. His movements were too deliberate. I had seen him under the influence before, high off something stronger than liquor, eyes glazed, speech slurred. But this wasn't that. This was controlled, calculated, and that was what made it terrifying. My finger hovered over the rewind button again. Every instinct told me to stop watching, to shut the laptop, to pretend I never saw it, but I couldn't. Diddy sat there, eyes locked on something beyond the screen, his breathing eerily slow. Then came that moment, the one that sent ice through my veins. He nodded, listened, murmured something under his breath, not to the phone, not to anyone I could see. His lips moved in a way that was almost reverent, like he was answering to someone of higher authority. A call had ended nearly a full minute ago, and yet he was still reacting, still responding. And the worst part? He wasn't just speaking. He was listening. My stomach twisted. I scrubbed the video back again, turned the volume up to the highest setting. Silence, just the occasional crackle of static. But Diddy was hearing something. I pressed play, forcing myself to watch every micro-expression, every twitch of his jaw, the way his fingers tightened around a glass of whiskey. Then, just as I thought I had seen everything, something shifted in the frame. It wasn't big, not at first. Just a flicker in the bottom left corner, near the edge of the screen. A shadow? A glitch? My breath caught in my throat. I rewound, played it again. There. It happened in the space of a blink, a distortion in the background just behind him. Not an object, not the light catching something reflective. It moved, and it moved with intent. I rewound again, paused, stared. The shape was undefined, but it was there, and that was all I needed to know. Diddy turned his head ever so slightly, the kind of motion people make when someone whispers in their ear. His brow furrowed for a second, and then he nodded, a small, understanding dip of his chin. His lips moved. "Yes," he said softly. "I know." I felt cold all over. I dragged my palm over my face, exhaling sharply. This wasn't just a slip-up. This wasn't just an accidental recording. This was something else entirely. The rumors had always been there. whispers in the industry about the real power behind Diddy, about the people, if you could even call them that, who controlled everything from the shadows. People who didn't have names, who never showed up in headlines, but whose influence stretched across cities, industries, and government. Some said it was old money. Others said it was something older than money. And now, watching this footage, I had to wonder if it was true. I checked the timestamp on the video, a little past midnight. That's when it always happened, wasn't it? The real conversations, the real deals, the real exchanges, they never happened under the bright light of day. They happened in rooms like this, when the world outside was asleep, when the only witnesses were the ones who didn't have to play by the same rules as the rest of us. I played the footage again. The static in the background wasn't just static. It had a pattern, an irregular pulse, like breathing, faint, almost imperceptible, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unhear it. Diddy's fingers twitched, his eyes flicked down. He wet his lips. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke again. "They're watching, aren't they?" I went still. The room around me felt suddenly too exposed, the laptop too bright, the windows too uncovered. I turned my head slowly, looking around as if expecting to see something standing in the shadows, just out of sight. The paranoia crept in fast, sinking deep into my bones. I wasn't supposed to see this. My breathing grew uneven. The footage was only a couple of hours old. Diddy was still in this city, still within reach, if I had it. Did that mean someone else had it too? I sat there, unmoving, as the seconds crawled by. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a trick of the light, an artifact from the compression of the video. But I didn't believe that. My gut told me otherwise. I forced myself to look at the screen again. The last thing he did before the recording ended was smile. It was small, barely there. But it was the kind of smile you make when you know something no one else does. A chill ran down my spine. My fingers hovered over the delete button. That would be the smart thing to do. Erase it, pretend I never saw it, walk away while I still could. But I didn't. Instead, I reached for my phone. My hands were clammy, shaking slightly as I scrawled through my contacts, my mind racing. Who could I tell? Who could I trust? Who would believe me? Before I could think too hard about it, I hit dial. The phone rang. Once. Twice. A third time. My stomach knotted. Then, a voice picked up on the other end, groggy, irritated. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table. "Listen," I whispered. "I need you to see something." Chapter 3. The silence before the storm. The call ended, but I didn't move. The room felt colder, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees, though I knew it hadn't. My phone sat face up on the glass table, the screen dimming to black, but my reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed, jaw tight. I hadn't even realized I was gripping the edge of the couch until I flexed my fingers and felt the soreness in my knuckles. I needed to think. I needed to get ahead of this before it got ahead of me. I checked my emails first, scrawling with the kind of slow, deliberate movements people make when they're afraid of what they might find. Nothing. No alerts, no flagged messages, no suspicious contacts. I switched to my texts, just spam. Promotions, an old group chat buzzing with meaningless memes, a couple of work updates that suddenly felt like they belonged to a different life. Nothing. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. If I had the only copy of this footage, that meant I had control. But if someone else had it, someone who shouldn't, then things were already spiraling in ways I couldn't predict. I stood, pacing to the window, careful not to stand too close. The penthouse overlooked Manhattan, the streets below alive with movement, taxis crawling, red lights blinking in the distance. I scanned the sidewalks, the intersections, the parked cars. Looking for what? a shadow, a figure standing too still, a black SUV idling a little too long. I knew how these things worked. I had been around the industry long enough to know that accidents weren't always accidents, and missing people weren't always lost. I turned back to my laptop. The video file sat there, innocent in appearance but heavy in reality. I hovered my cursor over it, the thought crossing my mind again. Delete it, walk away, pretend you never saw it. But I couldn't, because I had seen it, and what was seen couldn't be unseen. I racked my brain for who could have leaked that first clip. It hadn't been me, but the fact that even a fraction of the video had surfaced meant that someone else, somewhere, was playing a dangerous game. I thought about a conversation I had weeks ago, back when things still felt normal. I was at a club, one of those after-hours spots where the real business happened, not the ones with bottle service and social media influencers posing for pictures, but the ones where deals were made, where people whispered names and numbers, where reputations were bought and sold like stocks. I was talking to someone who had been in Diddy's orbit for years, a guy who kept his head down, always at the edge of the room, watching, listening. He wasn't famous, but he had influence, the kind of influence that didn't come with a spotlight, but with knowledge. "If you ever get something," he had said, his voice low, almost drowned out by the bass thumping through the speakers, "burn it before it burns you." At the time, I thought it was just industry paranoia, the kind of vague warning people threw around when they wanted to sound like they knew more than they did. Now, I wasn't so sure. I sat back down, rubbing my palms against my jeans. My options weren't great. I could go public, send the footage to a journalist, drop it anonymously online, let the world decide what to do with it. But that meant disappearing, going into hiding. The second my name got attached to this, I wouldn't be able to walk down the street without looking over my shoulder. I could sell it. That was riskier, not because no one would buy it, but because the wrong person might. Money had power, but power had something stronger: reach. A transaction like that could easily turn into a trap, and I wouldn't know until it was too late. Or I could delete it, pretend I never saw it, erase it from my laptop, my phone, my mind. But could I live with that? Could I go back to normal, knowing what I knew? The thought made me sick. I stood, walking to my apartment door. I checked the lock. It was still bolted. I looked through the peephole. Just an empty hallway, dimly lit. The air thick with the hum of quiet. No movement. But the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. I shut off all the lights, pulled the blinds closed. I moved my laptop to the kitchen counter, somewhere I could keep an eye on it but far enough away that I wouldn't obsess over it. My phone buzzed, and I nearly jumped. But it was just a reminder. A bill due in 3 days. I exhaled, shaking my head. I was spiraling. Paranoia was a disease, and I was catching it fast. I needed air. I needed clarity. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out onto the balcony. The city stretched beneath me, endless and alive. I gripped the railing, my breath slow, controlled. But even out here, in the open air, the feeling lingered. I wasn't alone. Not in the sense that someone was physically near me, but in the sense that somewhere someone else knew what I knew. That thought wouldn't let me rest. I stayed outside for a while, letting the cold bite at my skin, letting my heartbeat settle. When I finally went back inside, I locked the balcony door behind me. The air in the apartment felt heavier now, like something had shifted while I was gone. I checked my phone again. No new messages, no missed calls, just silence. But silence wasn't safety. Silence was the sound of something waiting to happen. I sat back down at the kitchen counter, staring at the laptop, at the file that shouldn't exist. The only thing worse than knowing too much was not knowing how many others knew just as much. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Chapter 4. The First Leak. Morning came, but I didn't feel the warmth of it. The sun pushed through the blinds, spilling streaks of light onto the wooden floor, but it might as well have been a street lamp in a back alley. I hadn't slept. I had barely moved. The laptop still sat where I left it, the screen black, the weight of its contents heavier than anything I had ever held in my life. I had spent the night cycling through the same thoughts over and over again, as if replaying them would somehow change the outcome. Delete the video, keep the video, leave the city, stay and figure out my next move. I reached for my phone, more out of habit than intent, and tapped the screen. The notifications blurred together, my eyes too tired to process them all at once. But one stood out, a link. No sender, no subject. Just a URL sitting in my inbox like a loaded gun. I clicked it. The page took a few seconds to load, and when it did, I felt the ground shift beneath me. The clip was only 7 seconds long, but that was all it needed to be. It was my footage, the one I had watched 100 times, the one that wasn't supposed to exist outside my laptop, but it was here now, online, staring back at me in the form of a grainy, compressed video file. The audio was distorted, the quality degraded, but I knew what I was looking at. Diddy, sitting in his chair, eyes locked on something unseen, nodding to whatever had spoken to him in that darkened room. His lips moving, forming words without sound. The caption beneath the video read, "Diddy caught talking to someone, who else hears the second voice?" A cold shiver ran through me. The post had barely been up for an hour, but the comments were already pouring in. "This is edited, right? Someone messed with the audio?" "And that's just a glitch. You ever see those Zoom audio overlaps? That's all it is." Diddy been on some weird shit, though. Y'all remember those stories? No one's talking about the fact that he's actually nodding to something? I clenched my jaw, scrolling faster. The reactions were split. Some people were laughing it off, chalking it up to a weird digital hiccup. Others, though, the ones who knew, who had heard the same rumors I had, weren't so quick to dismiss it. They saw what I saw. I refreshed the page. The video was gone. Just like that. I checked the profile of the account that posted it, suspended. I checked another thread where people had started discussing it. Error 444. I wasn't stupid. This wasn't an accident. This was a cleanup. Someone was watching, tracking, pulling the strings before things could get out of control, and I knew exactly who that someone was. My breath came shallow and fast. I ran a hand through my hair, gripping at the strands, trying to ground myself. I didn't leak it. I hadn't leaked it. So who did? The buzzing of my phone jolted me. A text message. No name, no number. Just a single line staring back at me like a warning etched into stone. "You should have deleted it. Now it's too late." My stomach dropped. The air in the room changed. I felt it, the way everything seemed to pull in tighter, suffocating me. The paranoia that had been creeping at the edges of my mind roared forward in full force. I stood too fast, knocking over the chair, the loud scrape of metal against wood making me flinch. My feet carried me to the window before my brain could catch up, my body reacting on instinct. Outside, the street looked the same as it always did. People moving, cars passing, nothing out of place. But that was the problem. Everything was too normal, too still. I backed away, rubbing at my face, pacing. This was a message. Someone had let this video slip on purpose, just long enough for me to see it, just long enough to warn me. I grabbed my laptop, my fingers unsteady as I refreshed my inbox. Nothing new, no follow-up messages, no explanations. I checked my texts again. The number was still unknown, still untraceable. I needed to move. Sitting in this apartment, waiting for whatever came next was not an option. I stuffed my laptop into my bag, threw on a hoodie, and grabbed my keys. My pulse was hammering in my throat as I stepped into the hallway, every sound heightened, every shadow stretching too far. I didn't know where I was going. but I knew I had to get somewhere else. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should have. My reflection in the mirrored walls looked foreign, tired, wired, eyes darting too much. I stepped out into the lobby, pushing past the concierge's half-hearted greeting, my body moving on autopilot. I hit the sidewalk, my steps quick but deliberate. The city was waking up now, early commuters spilling into the streets, taxis honking, the smell of coffee and asphalt mixing in the cold morning air. I tried to blend in, to shrink into the movement of the crowd. My mind kept circling back to the same questions. Who else had access to this footage? Why post it for only a moment? Why wipe it so quickly? Was this a warning? A test? I turned a corner and slipped into a small cafe, one of those places that never got too crowded. I took a seat in the back, my back against the wall, my eyes flicking toward the entrance every few seconds. No one followed me. I was sure of that. I pulled out my laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard. I had to check something. I logged onto a burner email, the one I used for things that didn't need to be traced back to me. I sent a message to an old contact, someone who used to work in cybersecurity, someone who knew how to dig without leaving fingerprints. Something just got wiped from the internet. Too fast, too clean. I need to know who's pulling the strings. I hit send. I closed the laptop, wrapping my hands around the coffee cup in front of me, letting the warmth seep into my skin. This wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Cleanup Crew. I sat in that cafe long after my coffee had gone cold, my mind spinning through scenarios, none of them good. The video had vanished, the clip erased from every corner of the internet, but the damage had already been done. Someone had put it out there, let it breathe just long enough for the right eyes to see, then wiped it clean like it had never existed. But it did exist, and someone wanted me to know that knowing was a mistake. I checked my inbox again. Nothing. I refreshed. Still nothing. I drummed my fingers against the table, scanning the cafe. A barista wiped down a counter. A couple of students hovered over their laptops, lost in their own worlds. No one looked out of place, but the paranoia had settled too deep to shake. I wasn't just being watched, I was being studied. I needed to move. I slipped out, weaving through the morning foot traffic, taking side streets, doubling back twice, watching reflections in storefront windows for anyone tailing me. By the time I reached my apartment building, my nerves were raw, my hands twitching at my sides. The doorman gave me a nod and I forced myself to return it, acting normal, like nothing was unraveling. Inside, I bolted the door and went straight for my laptop, logging onto my burner email again. Still no response. That wasn't like him. He worked fast. If he wasn't answering, it meant something had happened. I ran a search for any news updates, typing quickly, hands shaking. What I found made my stomach drop. A tech employee working for a private security firm had been found dead. The article was vague. A sudden accident, no foul play suspected, but I knew better. He had handled security footage for major clients. I checked his LinkedIn profile, scrolling through his work history. His most recent contract, Combs Enterprises. I closed the laptop and exhaled slowly. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. It was happening. Another search. A missing persons report. A housekeeper who had worked for one of Diddy's estates had disappeared. Last seen 2 nights ago. No signs of a break-in. No signs of struggle. Just gone. And then the third hit. A blogger. Not a major name, not a journalist with a press badge, just some independent voice who had latched onto the video leak, written a thread speculating on what Diddy might have been doing in that recording. He had been attacked outside his apartment. No suspects. In the hospital with a concussion and broken ribs. Mugging, the police said. Except nothing was stolen. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, breathing through the dread crawling up my throat. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a cleanup. I checked my phone. No new messages, no missed calls, but my gut told me I wouldn't be lucky for much longer. I shut my laptop and went straight for my bedroom, grabbing a duffel bag from the closet, stuffing it with clothes, cash, anything portable. I could disappear. I could leave right now. Then I heard it. A knock. Soft, measured, too polite. I went still, my breath catching in my chest. The knock came again. Harder. I stayed silent. My phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't move to grab it. I just stared at the door, my mind racing. Then the third knock. My phone buzzed again. I took a slow step forward, glancing at the screen. No caller ID, just a text. Open the door, or we open it for you. I felt my pulse slam against my ribs. This was it. The walls of my apartment suddenly felt suffocating, the air too thick. My fingers curled around my phone, but I didn't reply. I glanced toward the windows. Fire escape? No good. I was too high up and they'd expect it. The only way out was through that door. I took another step forward, heart hammering. Another knock, louder this time. I didn't answer. I checked my phone again, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. If I sent a message, if I reached out, who would even help me? A minute passed, then another. Silence. Then, finally, footsteps receding down the hall. I stood there, frozen, not daring to breathe. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. When I finally moved again, my body ached with the tension I'd been holding. I peeked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. No shadows, no movement. But I wasn't stupid. I grabbed my laptop, shoved it into my bag, pulled on a jacket. I was done waiting for the next move. I was getting out before they made sure I disappeared like the others. Chapter 6. The truth no one was meant to see. The decision came quietly, almost like a whisper in my own head. I don't even remember making it, just that somewhere between locking the door and pacing the living room for the 100th time it had already been made. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't live like this, waiting for the inevitable knock, the shadow at the end of the hallway. And I sure as hell couldn't pretend none of this had happened. I was going to release the footage. It was the only card I had left, the only move that wasn't just reacting. If they wanted me silent, fine, but they wouldn't be able to silence the footage once it was out, and the longer I sat here, the more I realized they weren't going to stop. They'd gotten rid of the tech guy, the housekeeper, even went after a blogger. I wasn't special. I was next. I sat down on the floor, back pressed against the cold wall, my laptop balanced on my knees. My hands moved automatically now, years of knowing how to stay under the radar, how to encrypt, double encrypt, how to spread information like seeds in a windstorm, upload to one server, mirror it on another, use decoy files, layer deadman switches. If they wiped one, another would pop up in its place. That was the goal, redundancy. But still, my fingers trembled as I worked. My body wasn't fooled by the cold logic. There was something primal gnawing at me, something that whispered I wouldn't get the chance to finish this. Every so often I'd pause and listen. I could hear the faint sounds of life outside, the city still alive, cars rolling by, someone arguing on the street, but all of it felt like it existed in a bubble, miles away from the heavy stillness pressing down inside my apartment. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting the handle to turn at any moment. I checked the time. Nearly midnight. Fitting, I thought bitterly. Midnight was when this all started, wasn't it? When the footage was recorded. When whatever deal Diddy had made in that room was struck. I tried not to think too hard about what exactly he'd been talking to in that video. Who or what had made him speak in that low, almost reverent voice. I pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the upload. It was crawling at a frustrating pace. 12%, 15%, I cursed under my breath. I had done everything to mask my IP, cover my tracks, but encryption slowed things down. It was safer that way, but every second felt like it stretched longer and longer. I grabbed my phone, opening the secure app to send out preemptive pings to a few trusted contacts, coded enough to not raise immediate red flags, but clear enough that they'd understand something serious was coming. My palms were sweating. I wiped them on my jeans and kept working. The laptop's fan kicked on, the only sound filling the room. I risked one glance at my phone battery, 18%. That was more than enough to finish, I told myself. Then something shifted. At first I thought I imagined it, the tiniest flicker of light at the edge of my vision. The apartment lights dimmed for a fraction of a second, a soft hum dying in the walls before kicking back up. My head snapped toward the window. The street lamps outside stayed steady. Cars rolled by. But the gut feeling returned, deep, immediate. I tried to ignore it, focus, upload at 47%, still crawling. And then the fume disappeared altogether. It wasn't gradual. It was like someone cut a cord with a knife. Everything died. The refrigerator, the hallway lights, the faint buzz of my router, the glow from the hallway under the door, snuffed out like a candle. Blackout. I froze. My heart hammered in my ears. I reached for my phone, flicked the flashlight on, casting shaky light across the room. The upload screen on my laptop went dark. I could already guess. The Wi-Fi was down, deliberate, targeted. They were here. I stood slowly, listening, every muscle tight. It was dead quiet outside my door. No footsteps, no voices. That made it worse. This wasn't random. This was planned. My phone buzzed once, an alert saying the connection was lost. I killed the flashlight, letting darkness swallow the room again. No sense broadcasting where I was. I crept toward the door, holding my breath. That same sense of something being off, like I was being watched through the walls, prickled at the back of my neck. And then the sound I'd been waiting for. Soft, almost polite, a knock. Not rushed, measured. I stood still, not daring to answer. The knock came again, louder this time. Then silence. My phone buzzed, vibrating in my hand. I glanced down. No caller ID, just one message. It's over. Open the door. I swallowed hard, fingers tightening around the device. My mind raced. I thought of bolting to the fire escape, but they'd expect that. Thought of calling for help, but no one was coming. I was alone. But I still had one move left. I dropped to my knees, scrambling to reconnect my phone's data. The signal flickered weakly. I didn't need much, just enough juice to get the file sent out. Forget the upload. Forget the dark web forums. I'd send it direct. I found the video file, encrypted copy still intact. Attached it to an email. Typed out one address. A journalist I trusted enough. No explanation, just one line in the subject. If something happens to me, pause this. The bar crawled agonizingly slow. I could hear something on the other side of the door now. Movement, shifting weight. They were waiting. 20%. My phone buzzed again. Last chance. 40%. I wiped sweat from my forehead. My battery dipped to 7%. 60%. The handle twitched. 80%. A breath outside the door. Close. 90%. I held my breath. And then the door burst open. The shadows rushed in. But before they could reach me, my thumb hit send. The last thing I saw was the notification, message sent. Then everything went black. Chapter 7, The Vanishing Act. By the time the sun rose over the city, my apartment no longer existed, not in the way anyone remembered it. It stood there physically, of course, the walls intact, the locks still functioning, the furniture arranged neatly as if nothing had ever happened. But the person who had lived there, who had sat hunched over a laptop night after night, watching that cursed footage, was gone. Erased. The apartment was sterile now, empty, every trace of me wiped clean like chalk dust off a blackboard. Neighbors who passed by in the hallway might have noticed something was off, the way the door was left ajar one morning, or how the mail started piling up unopened. But no one asked questions. In this city, people learned early to mind their own business, especially in buildings like mine, where the rent was high and privacy was a currency. Inside, there were no signs of struggle, no broken furniture, no blood, just silence. My devices were gone, my phone wiped, my laptop, hard drives, every bit of hardware that had once been a portal into my life, all vanished. Digital footprints scrubbed, social media accounts deleted, email addresses bouncing back error messages. As far as the world was concerned, I no longer existed. That was exactly how they wanted it. Diddy's people moved fast. They always did. They had the resources, the money, and most importantly, the reach to make sure loose ends disappeared without leaving ripples. When they wanted something gone, it was gone. And for a moment, it looked like they had succeeded. The narrative they crafted was airtight, a story that would never make headlines because it didn't need to. No missing person report, no investigation, just another face quietly removed from the scene. A whisper, if anything, passed between people who knew better than to speak too loudly. The apartment was swept, files destroyed, networks severed. But the thing about erasing something completely is you have to catch every copy, every thread, every person. You have to be faster than information itself. And this time they weren't. Because by the time they kicked down that door, I had already hit send. The file had scattered like seeds in the wind, carried to places they couldn't reach in time. It started slow, almost imperceptible, a single post on an obscure encrypted forum, someone claiming to have the full footage, daring others to download it before it was scrubbed. Most users laughed it off, another hoax, another piece of clickbait. But curiosity got the better of them. Downloads happened, links got copied, threads reposted. Within hours, it slipped beyond the original forum, appearing on private message boards, anonymous chat rooms, hidden corners of the internet built for the express purpose of keeping things out of sight. It was like a virus, replicating quietly but relentlessly. The takedowns came fast, as expected. Diddy's legal teams sent cease and desist orders to service providers, threatened lawsuits, pushed platforms to comply. Some did. Some shut down the links immediately, but no matter how many files they deleted, more would pop up elsewhere. Mirrors of mirrors, encrypted zip folders disguised under innocuous names, invite-only circles sharing thumb drives and USB sticks, passing them hand to hand to avoid detection. By the end of the first day, it was no longer a secret. It had become a ghost, a piece of forbidden knowledge spreading underground where the usual rules didn't apply. It wasn't long before people started talking. At first it was the usual suspects, anonymous accounts, conspiracy threads, people who spent too much time in dark corners of the web. They dissected every frame of the video, posted theories, speculated on who or what Diddy was talking to in those last haunting minutes of the recording. Some dismissed it as doctored. Others latched on to the weirdness, claiming it confirmed rumors they'd heard for years. But it didn't stop there. Former associates began to surface, not in public interviews, not yet, but quietly through back channels. People who used to work within Diddy's circle, who had long since moved on or been pushed out. They started feeding crumbs to bloggers, to small-time journalists, to anyone who would listen. Nothing concrete, nothing directly incriminating, but enough to paint a picture. It was about late-night meetings that no one was allowed to document, unmarked guests slipping in and out of properties, phones confiscated, NDAs thicker than books, And always, that feeling hanging in the air that something wasn't right. Industry insiders, too, began to shift. You could see it in how they moved at events, the way certain names stopped being mentioned. Conversations became more careful, rehearsed. Public posts that once boasted alliances and friendships now went conspicuously quiet. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. The illusion of control was cracking. Even a few celebrities couldn't resist poking at it. An offhanded comment here, a cryptic tweet there. Enough to get people asking questions, but not enough to draw lawsuits. They knew better than to get directly involved, but curiosity is a powerful thing, especially when you've lived in the same circles long enough to know when someone at the top is scrambling. The damage control machinery couldn't keep up. Diddy's camp tried to put out fires, issued statements dismissing the footage as manipulated, the product of digital trickery, threatened legal action against anyone who dared share or comment on it publicly. But the more they pushed, the more obvious it became that something had slipped through their fingers, because this wasn't the type of scandal you could squash with press releases and corporate lawyers. People weren't reacting like they usually did. They weren't waiting for the story to die down or move on to the next headline. This time, the silence itself felt louder than the noise. And behind all of it, behind the headlines and deleted posts, there was still that lingering question. The thing no amount of cleanup could erase. What exactly had Diddy been talking to? Because that was the part no one could explain away. It wasn't the quality of the footage or the glitches in the audio. It was the unmistakable fact that in those final minutes of the recording, he wasn't alone. He was listening, and whoever or whatever he was listening to wasn't visible on camera. Speculation turned to obsession. Frame-by-frame analysis videos started surfacing, people slowing the clip down, enhancing shadows, pointing out tiny details, a reflection in a glass, a shift in the light, the faintest distortion in the background. Every attempt to dismiss it as a technical glitch fell apart under scrutiny, too deliberate, too synchronized with his reactions. He spoke with reverence. He nodded like a man taking orders, and the words themselves, "If this gets out, we're all dead," played over and over like a mantra, impossible to ignore. The people who usually stayed quiet had no choice but to pay attention now. For the first time in a long time, the empire looked fragile. It wasn't just about one piece of footage anymore. It was about everything that had built up over the years. The lawsuits, the stories whispered at after-parties, the rumors of things happening behind closed doors that no one dared confirm. All of it bubbling to the surface because a single slip had cracked the foundation. They had erased me. They had cleaned the apartment, scrubbed my data, buried the fact that I ever existed. But the footage, that couldn't be buried. Not anymore. Chapter 8. The House of Cards falls. It didn't happen all at once. Empires never collapse overnight, no matter how sudden it might look from the outside. What really happens is more like rot spreading beneath the surface, quiet, invisible, until the day comes when the structure can't hold itself up anymore. And when it finally falls, it's not just the weight of one mistake that brings it crashing down, it's everything that was hiding underneath. By the time the major news outlets picked up the story, it was already too late. The footage had circulated far enough, lingered in the right circles, mutated in the dark corners of the internet where takedown notices held no power. For weeks, it had been the subject of underground chatter, speculative posts, encrypted group chats, cryptic tweets. People had dissected every frame, debated whether it was real or doctored, whispered theories about what they thought it meant. But eventually, the mainstream couldn't ignore it anymore. It started small, a short segment buried deep in a morning show broadcast, framed as just another celebrity controversy, something light enough to fill a few minutes between fluff pieces. They played a heavily redacted version of the footage, the audio clipped, Diddy's face blurred just enough to avoid a lawsuit. The hosts made nervous jokes, laughed it off, moved on quickly. But the clip spread anyway. By noon, it was being reposted on bigger platforms. Headlines sharpened. Phrases like disturbing behavior and unexplained footage appeared alongside his name. By evening, it was everywhere. And once the news cycle sank its teeth in, the floodgates opened. The old lawsuits resurfaced first, ones people had forgotten or wanted to forget. Allegations that had been buried under settlements and NDAs, court records sealed, accusers silenced. But the footage gave them new relevance, new weight. Reporters dug up documents, interviewed sources who hadn't spoken publicly in years. Suddenly, patterns that had seemed isolated didn't look so isolated anymore. Investigators who had shelved old cases dusted them off, emboldened by the public interest. Some subpoenas were filed quietly, but others made headlines. The pressure mounted fast, faster than anyone expected. Diddy's team scrambled to respond, issuing statements, doubling down on denials, threatening legal action against anyone who dared to suggest the video was real. They tried to spin it like they always had, but the public wasn't buying it this time. Because the footage wasn't just another scandal. It wasn't a drunken outburst caught on camera or an embarrassing soundbite. It was something different, something that made people feel uneasy in a way they couldn't quite articulate. They watched him sitting alone, nodding, listening, speaking to someone or something that wasn't there, and no matter how many experts they trotted out to explain it away, no one could shake the feeling that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. And then the insiders started talking. Not directly, never directly, but enough. Former employees, old collaborators, people who had once been part of the machinery but had long since been pushed out, they started leaking darker stories. Whispers of things that happened behind closed doors, of meetings where no phones were allowed, of parties where the guest lists weren't just exclusive, they were secret. The rumors about rituals, about recordings that never saw daylight, about power games that went beyond money or fame, all of it bubbled back up. No one dared put their face to it. The danger was still too real, but the details aligned too well to be dismissed. Diddy's carefully built web of power began to fray at the edges. The partnerships, the endorsements, the brand deals. One by one, they distanced themselves. Quietly at first, then publicly. Apologies were issued, contracts were terminated. His name vanished from event lineups, his label artists conspicuously silent. The industry had a way of turning cold the second something became inconvenient. And still the footage spread. It became something more than a leak, more than a scandal. It became a symbol of everything people had whispered about, but had never dared to say aloud, about what power really looked like, about how much was hidden beneath the surface. Diddy went into hiding. That's what the headlines said. No public appearances, no statements, no new posts on social media. The mansion gate stayed closed, paparazzi circled, but the blinds were drawn. There were murmurs he'd left the country, fled to some private island where his reach still extended. Others speculated he was negotiating behind the scenes, trying to salvage whatever was left. But it didn't matter, because no one believed him anymore. The cracks were too deep. Too many people had seen the footage, and no amount of PR could unsee it. The denials rang hollow. The empire had been built on an image of control, of invincibility, but once people saw behind the curtain, the spell broke. Everything collapsed. But even as the headlines shifted from scandal to fallout, even as lawsuits piled up and former allies distanced themselves, one question remained. It lingered in comment sections, in whispered conversations, in the kind of late-night debates where no one had answers. Who or what had he been talking to? It wasn't something people could dismiss as paranoia anymore. They'd seen the footage. They'd watched his eyes move, watched his lips form words that no one on the other end spoke. They'd seen the slight tilt of his head, like he was listening carefully, and they'd seen the fear behind his composure. The kind of fear no amount of wealth or influence could hide. No explanation satisfied, not technical glitches, not doctored video claims, not staged theories. None of it made sense. The truth sat just out of reach. Some people said it was proof of something darker, a glimpse into the kind of deals powerful men make when no one's watching. Others went further, dredging up stories of secret societies, occult practices, things older than fame and money. Theories spiraled into places no one could quite verify, but the unease remained. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the world wasn't supposed to have an answer. Maybe the real power came from knowing there were things out there we weren't meant to see, conversations we weren't meant to overhear. I disappeared. They made sure of that. But the story didn't end with me. It's still out there, rippling through the cracks in the empire they thought was unshakable. And the question still hangs in the air. What was he listening to? Maybe one day someone will figure it out. Or maybe the world was never supposed